Good evening and welcome to the Trainers Forum presented by HRD Specialized Canine Training. I am Paul Martin, your host. Tonight we have as our guest Cheryl Johnston. But first, let's pay a few bills. Oh, hold on. Getting swamped with everybody jumping in. But sometimes we all have to be reminded to just train the dog in front of you. So visit the shop and get your shirt today. So now I want to officially introduce our guest, Dr. Cheryl Johnston, who happens to be a diplomat of the American Board of Forensic Anthropology and a fellow of the American Academy of Forensic Sciences. And she and I have known each other for a little over a decade now. Originally, Dr. Johnston was my advisor and has become a mentor, friend, and colleague along the way. In a lot of ways, I would not be sitting here talking with y'all tonight if it weren't for Dr. Johnston pushing and prodding and sometimes kicking me along the route. But Dr. Johnston is the CEO of Grave Matters Group. It is a specialty group that is focused on the recovery of human remains and the detection and location of those remains. Also, she is a visiting assistant professor to the Department of Anthropology at the University of Cincinnati, and is also is an instructor at Ohio State University. And I have probably butchered all of that, but at this point in time, I would like to turn it over to Dr. Johnston.
Hi, everybody. Let me just get this rolling here. There we go. Thank you, Paul, for introducing me. As Paul said, I've got several apology, and by the way, Paul, you're a colleague now, not a former student. So let's just go with that. I'm going to talk to you guys a bit about forensic anthropology. And I know some of you guys know some of this material and some of you may be new to it. So if you have questions, just jot them down or put them in chat, or there will be a question session afterwards. But I want to introduce you to what we that I wanted to mention is that, well, actually, I'll just go ahead and mention it in a minute where it belongs in the lecture. So what we do may seem kind of like an odd fit with anthropology, but actually this field of forensic anthropology comes out of the little piece of anthropology, the little piece of the pie that deals with the physical nature, the biological nature of humans. So anthropology is divided into, it's the study of humans, a big picture, past and present, and it's divided into 4 different subdisciplines: archaeology, cultural anthropology, linguistics, and physical anthropology. And within those, historically, forensic anthropology has been associated with the anthropologists that focus on human osteology. And in the old days, that means that there would be museum and university anthropologists who would and say, they would ask, hey, is this something that we need to worry about? Is it human? But the field's changed a bit these days. And we also have to include archaeology in it. And archaeology is another of the major subfields of anthropology, but it deals with interpretation of past behavior. And when you think about archaeology, you probably think about, like 100,000, 10,000-year-old behavior, but yesterday's behavior is past behavior too. So archaeologists are very good and very well trained at looking at a setting, a scene, an assemblage, and figuring out what happened to cause that to be where it is now. So most of us have training in archaeology and in human osteology or physical anthropology. So, more recently, more of the subject, when you have a forensic anthropologist doing work for you or working with you, you're going to get somebody who's pretty well versed in all the different ways to look at humanness, but especially ways to interpret human behavior and the human skeleton. So the formal definition, there's different ones, but the simplest is that forensic anthropology is the application of physical or biological anthropology in a legal context. So what we do basically is to recover and analyze human remains for legal authorities, and those are usually coroners or medical examiners. We do participate these days in the location of remains, but often we're there at your side to identify things that dogs find and figure out whether they're human or not. So that kind of covers what the discipline is. And I'm going to start and talk in terms of searches. We do recoveries of scattered remains, and then we do excavations of burials. And then there's all kinds of other situations that might come up where remains would need to be recovered in the field that the forensic anthropologist would participate in. Now, I've been a huge fan of human remains detection dogs for a long time. Paul can attest to that, because when you're out in the woods like this, there's really just walking over the land and looking doesn't really, you'll never find it. It's not a feasible thing. So have a trained dog to be out there to find things with you. This is a site that Jeremy and I worked on. He's another student who's a colleague now, with Jennifer Jordan Hall and her dog Pocket. And didn't find anything that day, although not for lack of trying, and not for lack of trying to interpret what Pocket was telling us, which was basically that you're looking in the wrong place in this case. So we use those archaeological techniques that anthropologists learn when they study archaeology to recover human remains. And those techniques are designed to allow a systematic recovery of human remains where everything's well documented, so that if you went to court, you would be able to very thoroughly lay out what was where on a scene and what each object was there in relation to, and at what depth there were around the different things that you find in the scene. So using archaeologists, that's what they do all the time. They design and carry out controlled recoveries of physical evidence of the past. And so it's useful to, instead of reinventing the wheel, use those techniques that are already there in archaeology. Now, not all archaeologists are interested in doing this, but there are ones that do it all the time called forensic archaeologists. So don't think that all archaeologists are there's nuances, as you probably can guess, that you need to learn, but we do borrow techniques from archaeology. So the goals of recovery are to find all the elements, or one of the goals is to find all the elements of human remains that might be out there without damaging them. And there are several different ways things can get damaged. One of them is illustrated on the left here. This is a picture a colleague of mine has loaned me that shows trowel damage. There's a lot of things that can happen to bone that don't have much to do or anything to do with the event that led the person to die on the scene or be deposited on the scene. Might not have anything to do with the behavior that happened around the time of death, but rather are the remnants of some kind of damage that happened during the recovery. So when you think about an archaeologist who can do forensic recoveries, that's somebody so that they can help, that helps them to avoid making marks on bones like this trowel mark. The other picture on the right is from a case I worked recently. Most of what you see there is parts of a human cranium. I can see a few other things in there, but notice how fragmentary they are. This is a scene that before the anthropologist got there was walked over repeatedly, driven over a couple times. Horses rode through the area. People on horseback rode through the area. And then I got this, went out into the field and recovered this cranium. I'll show you another picture of it in a minute. I was able to put it back together, but it makes for a really hard case to distinguish between something that happened when the person died. You know, was this person's cranium fractured like this by some perpetrator that killed the person, or can all of this be chalked up to those things that happened in the field? And so that's where some of my expertise really can help. Some of my experience can really help to distinguish those things. So this is that scene. Another goal of the recovery is to record the location of everything that's found, including not just the bones, but other things too. And remember that the act of recovering materials from a scene actually destroys the context. And so it's kind of like, or a while back, who would liken it to interviewing a witness and then killing the witness. You can't go back. So when we're in the field, it takes a bit of time, but everything is well documented and recorded to the highest standard possible. Sometimes things intervene like the elements and, you know, bad weather or lack of personnel, but to the extent that we can, we're there to get things out in a controlled, systematic manner so that we can explain where everything was and what the scene was when we get into court. And so in this scene, we've got a baseline strung out with green letters marking each potential unit. And then off those units, we would have a 2 by 2 meter square. And especially kind of in the middle of the baseline where you see everybody and all the flags in this picture. But this way we could get it all on a map. And if it did go to court, we would have some documentation where things were located in the field. Now, this is a 2-dimensional scene. It's a surface recovery. It gets exponentially more complicated when it's a buried scene because you have to keep track of things in 3 dimensions then. But that's a whole nother story. So it's important to note things on the scene that might have affected what you find there. Things like to notice if there was access for scavengers or insects to disturb the remains. Could water have disturbed the remains? And in the scene I just showed you, the remains were strewn out over about a 20 meter, maybe 25 meter area, kind of along a line. So did water do that? Was there sunlight exposure? What sorts of plants were growing nearby that might have? So we note all these other kinds of things too. And there are other specialists you call in if you really have a situation where something like plants, for example, may have impacted the skeletal elements that you're collecting, then you would get somebody who does forensic botany, who can interpret maybe marks on bone that could be attributed to plants, or bones that aren't in anatomical position that maybe can attribute to plant growth and that sort of thing. So there are other specialists that work with us as well. Forensic entomologists to interpret some of the insect activity on the site and help to estimate the postmortem interval. So all these factors and plenty of others that I didn't mention for lack of time. Don't want to have you be here for 2 hours while I go through all these different things. But as you can imagine, there's a lot of things that can affect a scene, and things that can affect how the body decomposes, things that can damage the bones or move the bones, change the way the bones look. And so it's our job in the field to be cognizant of all that and to be able to document it for the best outcome of the analysis in the lab. So speaking of the lab, we look to answer another series of questions by examining the bones in the lab. And first one of these, actually, this is usually done in the field. I probably should have put it in the other section, but is to figure out whether it's human or not. And so I show you these 4 bones. These are all femurs, but them is human. And notice how they all look something alike, but they're all a little bit different. Because humans are primates and we're mammals and are related to a lot of other animals with skeletons, our skeleton is very similar in many regards to other animals. So if you look at the biggest bone, which is the one on the left, a lot of people think that's the human bone because it's big. If you look at the scale at the bottom, this one's maybe a good 9, 10, 11 inches long. But juvenile deer. And so this animal wasn't done growing yet. And the way we know that is because we can see these little lines that are, see if I can get a pointer up here, down around the ends of the bone. You can see these little lines. It makes it look like this piece of bone could come off, which at a certain age it could. And these two, so these are all different parts of the bone that are separate from the main part of the bone during growth to allow for some of that growth. They're called epiphyses, or secondary centers of ossification. And the main part of the bone is called the diaphysis, or the shaft. So this is a young deer. This animal is not a young animal. You can't see any of those lines in between the diaphyses and the secondary centers on this one. And it's pretty big too, but again, it's not human. This third one is kind of short and stubby. It's also a young animal and it's thick, but again, not human. And then the last one, the one that you may be most surprised to find is human, is actually the human bone. It's from a approximately 18-month-old human. Our bones look different when we're kids, and that's why it is probably the one that would, but most of the audiences that I talk to and show this slide tend to think it's this bigger one. So you can see that in the field or in the lab, wherever you're presented with bones, one of the first things you call is it human or not? And because forensic anthropologists have a lot of experience looking at bone, we have sort of a mental template for it. Like if you work puzzles all the time, you get pretty good at those puzzles and predicting where shapes will fit and things like that. It's sort of the same thing. We get what the skeleton looks like, even to the extent that fragments of it strike us immediately as human or not. Sometimes it takes a little bit of effort. For example, if you have a piece of the mid shaft of one of these long bones and it's just like a little fragment, it can be a little tricky, but that's probably the easiest part of the whole thing for us, is whether it's human or not. And then the second question is it modern? If it's not modern, then interested in it, if they're interested at all. And so if bones are brought to us, it's hard for us to know sometimes if it was modern or not, because a lot of that information is in the context that the bones were in. So in this picture here on the top left, this is a scene from inside the basement of a house here in Columbus. And you can see there's somebody kind of curled up in fetal position that was buried in this pit. And because we know something about the stratigraphy in this area, the soils in this area, the site formation processes, how the houses were built, how the land was prepared for the houses to be built, then we know that this person was not in a context that could have been archaeological or really old. So it was a context that was modern and turned out to be somebody who was murdered. So the picture, but this is somebody who was in southern Ohio, was buried pretty deeply up in the mountains in a very remote area, buried actually 6 feet under, which is not common in a forensic situation. Usually people dig much shallower graves, but they put some real effort in. And you can see that he's deep enough that the bones are even under the water table. So because we knew something through a little bit of research about what the soils were like and the stratigraphy in this area, and because we recovered this person, a prehistoric one or a historic one, we were able to say with, pretty firmly that it was a modern thing and it's a forensic situation. So if somebody brings me bones in the lab, like if they took all these bones out and just handed them to me, I might be able to say, yeah, this is modern because there's fillings in this guy's teeth. But a lot of people nowadays don't have fillings in their teeth, and you're really not able to cite evidence. Don't see the context. And of course, going into court is all about being able to show logically how you came to your conclusions with evidence. So it could be ancient and not of forensic interest. This is a really old 3,000-year-old person who's got some mummified tissue, who was basically deposited in a rock shelter about 3,000 years ago. And if I had not known the context of this, it could be very easy to mistake it for somebody modern. But in this case, certain features of the teeth and the fact that we knew the context clued us in that it was ancient. And so this was not a forensic case, but this was something that was recovered archaeologically. I'm just using it as an example of what might happen if you didn't know where it came from. And most of the time the answer is yes, but not always. This is I used to work in a museum, and in the collections, there was this string of hand and foot bones. And they weren't well documented. We really didn't know, why they were there, where they came from, or much about them at all. But they were able to figure out how many people are represented here, because your hand bones, for the most part, are fairly unique. They're unique right to left. And they're different from your foot bones, and there's some foot bones in here as well. So if we find a bone that repeats 5 times, like the left third metacarpal, we know there have to be 5 people represented here. And so even though if you just count these bones, they don't exceed the number of hand and foot bones in one human, you have to go by what's repeated. And so there are actually about, I think, 5 represented here. Now, it's always nice when you get in the lab after you've been in the field and you clean the bones and you can lay them out. And you can commence with your analyses. This is the skeleton that I showed you that was in the field where the skull was all crunched up, and it's been reconstructed, and you can see it all went back together pretty nicely. almost everything's here, missing one kneecap. We're missing the right femur, which went for the DNA extraction. So it wasn't that we didn't have it, it's that we documented it separately and sent it off. Missing a few foot bones. That's not unusual in a surface scatter, especially when somebody's been out on the surface for months, as this person had a pretty good recovery on the small bones of the hands up here that you can see. We were missing some things like a big part of the ilium on this right side. You can see there's a nice flat surface there. I think this probably happened when they bush hogged and that piece of equipment cut through this to give it this nice sharp edge. We didn't find the other part of it. It was probably pretty fragmentary. But anyway, it's not always the case that it's nice like this and you can lay it out and it's one person. Sometimes there are multiple individuals, or sometimes you only have one or two bones. And so those can throw a little bit more difficulty in your analysis. But what you're trying to figure out, no matter what you're brought, if it's human, you're trying to figure out how old they were when they died. Were they male or female? How tall did they stand in life? What ancestry were they part of? Did they have any pathological conditions that might speak to their individualization, or any trauma that might speak to the events surrounding their deaths? Is there anything else that we notice that gives us any clue as to who it was or what happened to them? And so we go through these steps in the lab, and I'll just briefly go through each one. We start with usually age. Is it an adult or not? If it's an adult, we can look at joint surfaces like this one on the left. You can see this is the pubic symphysis, which is right in the middle of your body in the pubic area. And this surface changes texture and sort of topography, for lack of a better word, as somebody gets older, as an adult. This doesn't help you with a kid. This is only going to help you with an adult. So it's been documented what the changes are and what to look for, and you can examine these and kind of tick off some things that you see, and it helps you to narrow in on maybe a decade of life, maybe an 8-year range or something like that. It's not going to get you down. The auricular surface, which is that big ear-shaped articular surface where the sacrum and the pelvis, bones of the pelvis meet, does the same thing. It changes in adults over time so that you can look for different changes, and it takes a little bit of practice to be able to recognize them, but you can then estimate within maybe a 5 or 10 year period or range how old this adult was. You can also look at the sutures of the cranium, and you'll notice in the figure on the left here, you can see the sagittal suture, or sorry, the coronal suture going across here. This is the front of the skull at the top, the back of the skull at the bottom, but you can't see the suture that goes down through the middle of it. On this example, on the other side, on the right, the one on the left is the front of the face is down here and the back of the head's up here. But you can see all those sutures. They're still really easy to pick out. They're continuous. There's no places in there to speak of where things have fused together. But in this person, they have, and you can't see any of one of the sutures. So there are two things that might come of this observation. One is how old the person is. But the other one is, this is really an unusual pattern of fusion. You don't usually have a whole suture close and other sutures remain completely open. It's usually kind of a gradual pattern. You look at different points on the skull, on the sutural lines, and you can get an idea of age. But when you have a whole suture that has done this and fused, that means there was probably some kind of cranial trauma. And so you won't want to use it for aging. You'll want to talk about what trauma that might have been accountable to. And what happened in this person's case, is that younger, they were hit over the head with a pretty solid object, and that caused that suture to fuse like that. All right. Now, if you have a kid, I call them subadults because that includes all the different categories from infant to late adolescent, then you have a whole different suite of things that you look at to estimate age at death. You look at their teeth. Teeth in kids are forming, erupting, being shed, and all those are events that speak to age. You can look at the diaphyses of their long bones for length and correlate that with some data in the literature to estimate age. You can also look at the development of these bones and which of those secondary centers I mentioned earlier have fused on to the primary centers and get an idea of their age from that as well. The second thing is to estimate sex. We can only do this for adults. For children, it needs to be done through DNA analysis. There's just not a real lot of the time method that we use for kids. But in adults, because adults have gone through puberty, the secondary sexual characteristics of the skeleton will be observable. And those include sexual dimorphic observations, sexually dimorphic features that you can observe on the cranium, such as a big brow ridge, like this bump you see here, or big muscle attachment sites, like the one that would be down here where the mastoid is, or in the back of the skull, there's even a big fan-shaped one that can be raised up right here. If those things are all big and robust, that means this person was pretty heavily muscled. And women, not always true, but in general. And that can give you some clues to whether you're looking at a male or female. But if you have something other than the skull to look at, for example, the pelvic girdle, then there's a lot of things that can really help with estimating if it's a male or female, because females are adapted skeletally to give birth and males aren't. So female pelvic girdles are wide because this little place right here where the neonate's head has to pass through has to have a big enough width for a large brained primate to fit through there, which is what humans are. That makes for some different dimensions and shapes in other part of the pelvis. It makes this notch right here wide. You can see how narrow it is up here in males. It makes this angle underneath the pubic symphysis wide. And you can see how narrow it is up here in males, and so forth. So there's a number of things we can look for that are correlated or highly likely to be there, considering that this person would be a female. We can estimate stature, which is how tall the person grew to be in life. And if we have a nice skeleton like this, where it's all pretty complete, or that other one I showed you, then you can actually measure all the parts that add up to stature and add them up and put some soft tissue factors in there and get a reasonably direct measure of stature. But if you don't have all of those, if something's missing, you can take an individual long bone and measure it like we're doing here on the right side of the screen and plug that number in to one of many regression formula that are out there in the literature that are specific to different ancestral groups and to the two sexes, and get an estimate of stature. And that's always going to be a range of 3 inches. It might be a range of 5 inches. It might be a range more than that. It just depends on the nature of the population from which the regression formula was derived. Ancestry is something we can speak to by looking at mainly dimensions of the mid-facial area. There are some sometimes subtle, sometimes not so subtle differences in the shape and width of various mid-facial structures and other cranial structures that speak to whether somebody's ancestors came from Africa, Asia, Europe, or maybe a combination of those. And there are some ways you can measure these and put metrics into a discriminant to big databases of people of known ancestry, and we'll tell you which data or which set of data your unknown looks most like, which is a pretty handy thing to do. And so we measure all kinds of different aspects. Here I am measuring cranial length here. And the way this works is somebody measures, somebody writes. This is Jeremy back here writing. And then there's a piece of software that we use to use those measurements to get an estimate of where the person's ancestors were from, what their ancestry might have been. And you get a few probability statements that indicate how likely that is to be accurate. And that's very helpful too. We're also looking at pathological conditions, and some of those are kind of subtle, like this little indentation in these vertebrae here. This is called a Schmorl's node, and it comes from the vertebra being compressed one against the other in life enough that the intervertebral tissue is kind of forced into some of this softer bone, and it makes this little channel. It can be something that comes from hard work, from a lot of running and jumping. So that it just speaks to activity to some extent, but it's also something that might be unique to a person and might help with an identification. Teeth are another thing we look for pathological conditions. This is a mandible from a child. She was about 4.5 years old at the time of death. And you can see this little area on this canine. These are all baby teeth. And so her baby teeth were all in. You can see that there's a place here on this canine where the enamel doesn't cover the dentin, which is the stuff that's underneath your enamel on your teeth. And that's not because it's broken away. It's because during the time this tooth was developing, the child was stressed in some way, some kind of physiological stress. Might have been malnutrition, it might have been an illness, it might have been psychological stress, and that will cause the biological machinery that is making these teeth to kind of go awry, and it's not going to produce enamel for a while until that stressor's gone. And so in this case, you can actually figure out based on where this defect is on the crown of the tooth about when it occurred. And in her case, this occurred around the time she was born. And I can't tell whether it's before or right after, but it wasn't very long after or very long before. One thing you do know is that if you see an enamel defect like this on a kid's tooth, that if it did occur in utero, it must have been a fairly rough assault, whatever it was, or rough, not really assault's not the best word to use there, but it was something pretty bad because the mother's body will shield against these things. And so if it actually did affect the tooth in a developing fetus, then it was something that the mother suffered. And then by virtue of that, the infant or the fetus suffered. That was pretty serious. Another thing that we look at, if you can look, I can't quite see this with my pointer because there's some other stuff in front of it, but down at the bottom end of these long bones, there are these really faint white lines. They're called Harris lines, and the same thing happens in bones. When you're stressed in some way, your growth's interrupted for a little bit. When it starts back up, in a way that produces a radiopaque line on the bone. The thing is that a lot of people have Harris lines. It's not a sign of a serious stressor like an enamel defect on a deciduous or a baby tooth is, but it is a sign of some kind of maybe illness. When I was in college, I sprained my ankle, had to have it x-rayed, and I was looking at the x-ray with the radiologist, and I'm like, there's Harris lines on my ankle. And the radiologist said, yeah, we see those all the time. Well, when I was growing, I didn't have anything particular stressful except maybe chicken pox or the flu a couple times. So it was probably something like that. So they have to be taken kind of in something to indicate poor health in someone. Sometimes there's things that look like they're from trauma, but they're not. We call them pseudo traumas. This is a little piece of skull, little fragment of a cranium, and you see all these little hatch marks on it. They look like some kind of cut marks or something, and actually they're not. What they are, these are the kind of the scars where a plant was growing in the ground next to this bone. And a lot of plant roots exude a little bit of acid, and acid can kind of dissolve bone a little bit. That hydroxyapatite can get soft and it'll kind of go away. And so the roots caused all this. It's called root etching. Sometimes you have something that's clearly not a pseudotrauma, like a gunshot wound. In this case, there's one right in the back of the skull, just a little bit above the foramen magnum. This was probably kind of an execution style thing where the head was tilted down and the person was shot. And then you have, in the same person actually, 2 other defects from projectiles entering the cranium. And so those are things that have to be carefully observed and acknowledged and documented and interpreted for a forensic case. Sometimes you see fractures. Fractures can be something that happened around the time of death. In this case, none of these fractures show any evidence of healing. They're all kind of sharp. The margins are a little bit sharp. And so most likely they occurred around the time of death. This is one from the same person. This is a fracture where it started to heal and it's got a callus. And that's what this bulgy thing is. Eventually, this will all remodel as long as the ends of the fracture stay pretty much in proximity to one another. And you may not notice it later, but while it's healing, you certainly do. And it turned out in this case that this person had 3 different stages of fracture healing in her ribs. I only showed trauma or perhaps a repeated abuse of someone. So it's important to document those. Okay. That is all I have to say. Paul, I'm going to stop the share. And I can answer questions. I see there might be something in the chat. Hold on a second. Okay, is the root etching an example of what you said earlier about plants affecting remains? Yes, definitely that's part of it. There are a lot of other ways plants can affect remains too, but anytime there's any kind of mark or defect on a bone that may have to do with a plant, it's useful to know something about what the plant was. Sometimes we collect samples of plants out in the field when we're recovering for that purpose. And it's useful to know something about its growth cycle. And those are things that a forensic botanist can help with. Okay, there's one comment here that says left has pitting too, and I don't know what that's about.
That was in reference to the
July,
2 skulls that you shared, where the left skull, the sagittal suture had already fused.
Okay. Was that a question of any kind or just okay. Thanks, Joy. All right, any other questions?
Okay, here's a one that has come in. Can you speak a bit what might happen to an excavation when you near an area where Native American villages are? In other words, how has NAGPRA changed how law enforcement considers a burial? And that's from our friend, Dr. Kat Warren.
Oh, thank you, Kat. That's a good question. So it kind of depends on where you are and how well known the site is that that's of interest. Let me move back so I can see that again. In general, many times law enforcement aren't aware of those sites. Neither are coroners or medical examiners. So that's part of what often falls to the anthropologist, is to know a little bit of the prehistory and the history of the area where the remains have come from. And that's another good reason to be out in the field. Um, in in our state in Ohio, we don't have a really good mechanism. If somebody finds human remains, there's not a good mechanism in the state for figuring out whether they're Native American or not before they kind of get shuffled into, some category in a coroner's office. And that's a problem that anthropologists in Ohio are trying to solve. In other states, there would be a procedure for that. So once it was determined not to be Native American and perhaps a forensic interest, and that's something that the anthropologist can determine, then it would be under the purview of the medical examiner or the coroner. But if it's determined to be something that is Native American and prehistoric or historic, how NAGPRA applies depends on a number of things. Actually, it gets to be a little bit complicated. But if in Ohio, if it's not modern, it's not a forensic interest, coroner says, I'm not interested in that. But if somebody has just found it out walking, or if they don't have any clear way to dispose of it, they often put it in their evidence and just hold on to it. They may call an anthropologist or a museum at an anthropologist at a museum and ask them to add it to their collections. And all museums that get federal funding have a NAGPRA obligation. And so it would be put out in an inventory in the Federal Register eventually, that where this is, so that Native groups could claim it for repatriation. But not all the material ends up in that path. And so this is a question that there's an answer of how it should go and an answer of how it usually goes, and they're not the same answer. So I hope that question. Most law enforcement people aren't really too aware of NAGPRA. So it's kind of on the anthropologist to make sure that the right thing happens.
I know in
Okay.
my experience with this, like in Mississippi with remains, yes, law enforcement would be notified. And from there, at 20 years ago, the state actually had multiple archaeologists active, that were actual state employees throughout the state. All of that's been centralized into the state capital now, and they might actually ask one of those state archaeologists to come to a scene and take a look to determine, if they couldn't tell readily whether or not it was of modern or prehistoric origin, because in Mississippi, I know we've had dozens of mounds and archaeological sites destroyed through agricultural pursuit. So it became a fairly frequent thing for human remains to be showing up on some of these sites. So, but that was
Yeah.
whether
That's good.
it was kind of the discretion of
What were
the
you going to
farmer
say?
also. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah. Indiana has pretty tight laws about what happened, and they have people that are anthropologists that would be called to a scene like that. North Carolina's pretty good. It just varies state to state. There's not one route for that type of thing. depends on the state laws, and in some states they're really lax, and in other states they're tighter. Okay, there's another question. When someone at a young age begins taking hormones, how does it affect the bones? What is the long-term effect of these hormones that the transgender community use? I don't think it's real clear yet what the long-term effect on the skeleton is for those, but I do know that there are some cases where has been masculinized or feminized a bit by those hormones. I don't really have a lot more information than that. Often the skeleton, it takes a while for a skeleton to change. And so it may not do anything for years, but it tends to be the case that people are studying that, and I don't think it's well understood yet what it would do on the skeleton. I've just heard a few anecdotal cases that people have presented at meetings and things that address that, and there's not a clear answer. Paul, have you seen anything in the literature lately about that?
I have not seen anything in the literature lately. I think it was the 2012 conference there in Chicago that the first case of looking at sexual reassignment surgery and some of the bone sculpting that was done in a singular case, and the long-term effects.
Was that the Mike Warren's talk?
I no, I think this was out of South America. They brought it up out of South America. And I
Yeah,
think
so that's the kind of information that's out there.
yeah, it's very sketchy right now, and it's something that I think the community is aware of, but there's just not enough data on it.
Yeah, that's my perception too. Okay, here's another one. In your experience, do scavengers take large parts of bodies away, or do they consume where the body lies, or both? This is something, Paul, you probably should weigh in on. In our work in the body farm at Western Carolina, large scavengers couldn't get in there, so we don't have any studies that speak to the large ones, but Paul did some work with small ones. You want to talk about that?
Yeah, with some of the scavengers, a lot of it depends on which members of the scavenger guild are actually participating in that individual environment. Because with some of the smaller ones, like infant-sized remains, the entire set of remains were removed from the area if they could gain access. Whereas a little bit larger and toddler size remains, they didn't take large parts of the remains away. They tended to consume right there, and there was some scattering, but not to the grand scale of things. In some of the work and reviewing the literature, it's really dependent upon who is participating, because I know, like in North California, they've got a very, it's almost an anomaly with bear scavenging activity, where the bear took the remains down one side of a valley, across a river, and back up another side of the valley. And that's actually a very far distance for them. I know in looking at some of the work that's been done in Maine by her name just escaped me. Um, the forensic
Marcy
anthropologist.
Sorg.
Yes, Dr. Sorg, that uh, was one of the co-authors of the Cadaver Dog Handbook with Andy Brebman. A lot of those remains are consumed right there in place, and the remains are not really uh, carried away. Um, but when you look at some of the stuff from Texas and the Southwest, we have scavengers taking, you know, up to half a mile to a mile away, actual chunks, leg elements and things like that. So it really depends on what is the environment you're working on in and the um, members of the scavenger guild locally. I don't know if you've seen
Yeah.
anything else.
Out there that speak to different types of scavengers. And I think it is something that, different animals or different species treat these things different ways and in different contexts. So I don't think you can make a sweeping statement that, they tend to do this or they tend to do that. I think it's a little bit more complex than that. Let's see. So on the slide with the 4 long bones, can you identify what the other 3 bones were? Yeah, I usually do that. I'm sorry, I didn't do it this time, but the one on the far left, the big one, is a deer. The one just to the right of that, that's a little bit smaller, is a dog, a pretty big dog. The one that's kind of thick and chunky, that was the human one. Let's see. And then somebody's asking, are the changes different from growth hormones used in children for growth issues? I would say yes, but I can't cite any literature on that, but just knowing a little bit about what the 2 types of hormones are supposed to do. The ones that are used in children who aren't growing appropriately will sometimes they delay the fusion of the epiphyses and give the bones a little longer to elongate before they fuse. They might, I would suspect that they would be less likely to have an effect on a skeleton that you would notice in a dry bone on the person later in life than the ones that are used for gender transition. Let's see. Oh, and then somebody says Idaho State University is having a webinar on transcending April 2nd, the impact of gender identification in cold cases, Dr. Sam Blatt. That's interesting. So definitely something I think that would be. Has anybody else got anything?
Any other questions from Facebook? Okay. Not here. So, in closing, I want to extend a great big thanks to Cheryl for joining us tonight. Thank you for everything you do, have done, and will continue to do in the future. I know she is available to reach out to answer questions and things like that. I will say for everybody that is watching, You can join us next month. We will have Cameron Ford, who will be joining us on Thursday, April 29th. And then in just a couple of days, you will find tonight's recording available on YouTube at our YouTube channel, HRD Specialized Canine Training. And therefore, you can share it with your friends. And the link for the ISU webinar will be made available. So if you have any additional questions, please email me, psmartin@HRD Specialized Canine. Also, visit the website for future classes. And again, thank you, Dr. J, for joining us tonight. Great presentation, great questions, everybody from the audience.
Thank you, Paul. I sure enjoyed it. Appreciate you asking me.
You're welcome. Thank you. Everybody stay safe, treat each other with kindness, and most importantly, don't lick anything. It's not good for your health. Good night.